All right, welcome to April 17th. This is lecture 2 of 2. And I think this gets us off on the right path between yesterday's lectures and today's lectures in terms of our conversation about ethics. There's one more element to our diagram that we need to discuss as we begin to think through ethical discourse. And it's in regards to the limitations of our perspectives, our implicit biases, and the ways in which our stories have formed us to be able to see, to limit our capacity to see beyond our assumptions of the world. And that is the language of culture. When we are attempting to have meaningful ethical discourse, we need to understand the way in which culture shapes and forms groups of people to see the world differently, and then to also act within that world differently, and even to frame the conversation about ethics differently. So culture exercises both limitations and possibilities in the way in which the world is organized and ordered, and in our assumptions that we bring to the table in terms of our capacity to have meaningful conversations about ethical topics. So culture is the unseen hand, the backdrop of the transmission between the below line and above line. It's like the canvas on which all of this is being painted. Our culture, what we've lived into, grown up in, inherited, and been a part of. Our culture informs so much of that. One of the unique things about having ethical discourse within the context of the United States are the multiplicity of cultures present within the United States. The ultra rural, low population areas are, in terms of culture, miles apart, radically different than downtown Chicago, Illinois. And I want us to think about that. There are rural communities globally that have more in common with one another than they do the major metropolitan areas in their own countries. Likewise, there are cities that have more in common with other major cities than they do rural communities. There's a multiplicity of cultures present within the context of even the United States. And I want you to think about that. I'm going to give you one quick example. Let's take gun control. Think about gun control within the context of an ultra-rural community where hunting and wide open spaces and shooting as sport is a way of life, a sense of cultural assumption that's always operating in the background. When you start talking about Second Amendment, it means something different in that rural community, shaped by a certain moral fabric based upon its cultural canvas, than it does in a city like Chicago, where we see regularly the abuse and misuse of firearms that continue to take people's lives. So the way in which that discussion is going to be had needs to be understood as culturally conditioned. And those cultural assumptions bring to bear on the conversation something deeply impactful that shapes and forms how we understand the world. And one of our inabilities to have meaningful conversations about ethical discourse is our inability to stand in other cultures or understand other cultures so that we can recognize the perspectives that shape those cultures. And those cultures are mediated through the ways in which people sort of exist and experience life around them, through the artifacts. And by artifacts, I mean, you could talk about the clothing, the music they listen to, what they drive. Like, cultural artifacts are the tangible elements, the food they eat, that represent their culture, through its six systems and structures and how people organize themselves within communities. Cultures are present in the midst of all of that. And so culture as the canvas, the backdrop on which all of the above the line and below the line is being worked out, needs to be taken into account in terms of our conversation about ethical discourse, because it informs how we understand the right, good, true, and noble. So let me give you a couple suggestions here. This is based off some work that David Livermore does on what's called cultural intelligence, or the ability to engage life cross-culturally. He identifies there are certain binaries that shape our cultural way of being in the world. So in the United States, identity plays a huge role. the individualism, the rugged individualism of the United States shapes a kind of culture where personal, private, individual rights sort of serve as the basis through which we make certain decisions, whereas in a more communitarian community or culture, they're gonna make decisions what's based better for the entire community rather than the individual. So the I versus we shapes a posture towards ethical deliberation, ethical conversation, ethical discourse. Hierarchy, how we understand rule of law, how we understand organizational structure. Is it top down or is it flat? In certain countries, think India, where there's a caste system, and there's a high reverence paid to those whose status, their place in the hierarchy is higher than you. Whereas in the United States, we typically have a very flat understanding of hierarchy, meaning that the dude in the White House is just a man like me who ended up in a position I put him there, right? And there's not always a lot of deference of respect and reverence to people who are in official roles of leadership, whether it's governmental, whether it's organizationally, whether it's corporate, whatever that looks like. Even within the context, even families, there's a dispute as to how much reverence ought to be paid towards the hierarchy. So decisions about ethics are shaped by how we understand hierarchy. Risk, tight versus loose. Certain communities are, when it comes to how we understand risks and the riskiness of life, they have tight control. They're not willing to take many risks. Everything is structured and ordered very clearly. Whereas in certain communities, in hopes of living into freedom and liberty, there tends to be a loose restriction on risk and an ability to take chances, right? And that informs our even postures about how rigid and strict we ought to define certain rules and certain ways of understanding what is right, good, true, and noble. Time, short-term versus long-term. In the United States, we're short-term thinkers. Everything is made, sort of ad hoc. We have a short historical memory, meaning we can't have conversations about racism because we say that was an old thing, not realizing that many of our grandparents grew up in the time of Jim Crow laws. So we have a short historic memory. Whereas you pose that to like Japan or China, where they think in terms of millennia instead of like decades. And so there tends to be a different posture towards the decisions that are made regarding ethics based upon the way in which we understand time. Communication, explicit versus implicit. So in certain cultures, to say things abruptly or outright would be considered an infraction, not what is right, good, true, and noble. You communicate sort of implicitly, like you pay attention to nonverbal cues. You don't call people out in the open. You have those conversations very, very reverently, very respectfully off to the side. Whereas in the United States, in a boardroom, people will call each other out right and left. People will call each other out on social media and not think twice about it because we have an explicit form of communication where we're more apt to say things abruptly in search of being true to self and genuine. And I think that can set the stage for how we understand the ethical dialogue. And then achievement, being versus doing. We tend to, in the United States, being a doing culture, right? So we're measured by what we do, how we do it, how successful we are at doing what we do, which leads to a form of pragmatism where we make decisions based upon what works best for the most, right? And in that pragmatism and utilitarianism, we'll discuss later, sort of at times go hand in hand. And then, or are we being shaped? Like, do we understand the kind of person that this makes us? One of the questions we'll get into in terms of ethics is the difference between sort of situational ethics that determines what we do based upon the situations we find ourselves in, or virtue ethics, making decisions about our ethical discourse based upon the kind of person that I hope to be. And we'll talk about how that factors in. But ethical discourse is run through these layers of cultural embeddedness. So when I have a conversation about the right, good, true, and noble with someone from China, from Japan, from India, from the Middle East, I need to understand that culturally they understand the world differently. The backdrop, the canvas is different than mine. And so I'm going to see things based upon a perspective or an understanding of the world that is different than the way that they understand the world to work. And that is going to inform some of the breakdowns and divisiveness that we have in terms of our ability to have meaningful constructive conversations about the right, good, true, and noble. So I want you to think about those things. I set the stage in the first lecture and talked about culture in the second lecture. We'll break these down as we move into next week's lectures and continue this forward.